Okay.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our discussion today. I'm Keisha Rogers, and for those who don't know me, and I wanted to get up here and introduce my good friend and colleague, Michael Steger, who's going to be our speaker for today. We wanted to have this special meeting. Michael's going to be addressing us. He'll be on just a few moments online with us. Those who are watching online will have the opportunity to hear Michael. If you have any questions, you can send it in to us. But otherwise, I think we want to start with this. The reason why we asked him to speak is there is an extraordinary upshift and development going on in the world right now. And I think that his presentation is going to capture both the trip that he just came back from, that many people may have heard from our LaRouche PAC website, that Michael was just invited as a part of a 400-person delegation to go to China to represent the Schiller Institute. And what I wanted him to do is to give a sense of the significance and the importance of that trip, but not only that, but to really situate the top-down strategic picture of where we are in the world today. And I think what you will find in this discussion is that Michael's going to lay out the history of Lyndon LaRouche and his wife Helga LaRouche and our movement in shaping the next 50 years outlook for mankind, the importance of the Belt and Road Initiative, not just as a project that's going on over there in China, but something that is critically important for the direction of all mankind to bring forth a positive direction. Now, what I wanted to bring people's attention to is, first of all, I would say that a fitting title and discussion for Michael's presentation and what we want to get across here today would be taken from a message from an article that Helga LaRouche wrote just a few weeks ago titled, "China's Vision for a New Silk Road, a Nightmare for Evil People, but a Dream for Mankind." And I like that title, so I wanted to use that. And I think that's exactly what we're defining right now, that we are creating nightmares for the evil people, and we're bringing mankind in the great vision of the dream of the future for progress, development for the next 50 years. And speaking of giving the evil people nightmare, and Michael will go through this in more detail, if people have not seen the special investigative report that LaRouche PAC and has initiated and released on Robert Swan Mueller, written by Barbara Board. Robert Mueller is an amoral legal assassin. He will do his job if you let him. And this report is being circulated in mass right now throughout Washington, D.C., in Trump Towers in New York, and it is getting reverberating effect. And the fact of the matter right now is that the criminal apparatus that is behind and working alongside Robert Mueller is absolutely being outflanked at their job, at their crimes right now, and is being exposed as an absolute fraud. So we'll go through that, and I want to tell people we do have some of these reports available. The importance of it is that it details not only a recent picture of some internal conflict within the United States, but it really details the last 40, 50 years of the fight of Lyndon LaRouche to bring about this conception of a new economic recovery, a new economic paradigm, which we're seeing taking place right now, which Michael's going to go through. And the pamphlet details the history of LaRouche in fighting against this criminal apparatus. It's absolutely important. Everyone should read it. Finally, what I wanted to just say before I turn it over to Michael is that we have now 5,000 of these very sharp and handy, what we call push cards or distribution cards, They are available here. We have already started to circulate them. They're being circulated around the country. Here, we want to hit all the congressional offices, different political groups, institutions, anybody who wants to know the truth about what's going on and why we are being denied access into that greater future of joining with the Belt and Road. Because the witch hunt going on against President Trump is not an internal US conflict. It's because the direction that the world and mankind is going in with the Belt and Road Initiative of China is something that they want to stop at all costs. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that the United States joins with China, with the mutual cooperation for the benefit of the US, China, and every nation in the world to uplift people out of poverty. And what this actually goes through is a push card that directs you to the dossier that you can get out on your Facebook, online, and anywhere that you see fitting. So with that, I think we will be very inspired by what Michael has to say today, and hopefully it will give people a sense of really taking off boots on the ground and getting active as much as you can to make sure that we can win this fight for mankind. So with that, I'd like to introduce my good friend Michael, and we will take questions and comments after.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Not well enough.
We're gonna tune your volume. Just keep talking. We'll tune it.
Keep talking. Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to speak to you guys today. It's kind of a remarkable moment in human history.
Up a little, Mike.
I think everything okay?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Keep talking.
Okay, all right. Sorry if the visual is a little bad. Sorry. I found out today Windows 10 doesn't allow you to change your webcam settings anymore. So anyway, so but the moment in history is somewhat striking. So what I want to do is kind of situate it in the broad course of things, and then kind of give people a sense of the trip to China in that context, because I think that's going to be important. Just as well, at least it's one indication of things. But then I want to go, as Keisha said, get to the Mueller dossier and what we're looking at over the next couple of weeks, which is Trump's trip to Asia. And not surprisingly, we have a blackout by the media conceptually of what this trip means, what's actually taking place, as we see with the ongoing attacks against Xi Jinping and against China. In the recent week with the Communist Party Congress that's been taking place there. So let me start with something which I think is really important, which is a quote from Lyndon LaRouche. This is a webcast that he presented in 2010, and I think you'll find it relevant pretty quickly. He says, "We're now in the position to change history. This is the way it happens. You have two factors in history. You have the so-called objective factor, the way things are moving, the perception of interest, the fears, the hopes of people. And you would say, well, why don't these things control politics at all times? Well, it doesn't. You come to a change in a general mood. It was the kind of thing that Shelley refers to in the case of his A Defense of Poetry. People at large are gripped by something they do not always understand, but it compels them to act in a certain way, perceived in their own interest. And generally, often, it represents a nobler quality, aroused in that people than they had represented before." Now in this quote, which I quote in an editorial in the EIR this week, he goes on to reference the American Revolution, the fight against slavery, and a general characteristic that what's shaped the United States politically has been this kind of quality of change in the mood of the population, not based on things that they understand, but based on a higher conception. Now, to review just the situation as it stands in the world today, I think if you take it with a certain step backwards to get a broader perspective, you can't help but recognize that it's very similar to what took place in 1989. And I don't mean that to say I want to compare the two. But we did have a unique moment at that point to change the entire perspective. And this is where the LaRouche organization, led by Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, as we know, put forward a conception for global development based on an East and West collaboration. The LaRouche organization is infamous around the world, or famous, I guess, and infamous in some circles, you might say, for proposing development projects going back to the 1970s. And I'll touch on that because it was really the basis for the trip to China. But when the wall came down in 1989, you had a breaking point. You had an opening up of a potential that this Eastern system of kind of the Soviet Union was now breaking down. But more so than that, it wasn't just the East, it was the Cold War dynamic. Because as we knew then, and we all know now, the West was as bankrupt. But consider, so just in that context, consider the upheaval of institutions right now taking place in the West. You might say it started with Brexit, where you saw that the political control over the political process in Great Britain was collapsing. And it was not so much the migration question or immigrant question, which much of the media and right-wing pundits try to make it seem, but it's the economic breakdown, the loss of industry, loss of manufacturing. But Brexit was a shock. We all know it was a major shock, and it took place just 16 months ago. It was just a little bit more than 5 months before Donald Trump's election. And with those two things, what do we now see taking place across the transatlantic? Every institution is now in total upheaval. No institution in the West is the same today as it was just 2 years ago. There have been total and fundamental changes. The political parties, the Republican or Democratic Party, are total upheaval. You have people leading the Trump administration, or people that worked within the Trump administration, this guy Bannon, but others who basically identify that the Republican Party is the biggest opposition to Trump's agenda. And as we know, there's far more policy coherence on infrastructure, on development, dealing with the debt problems of Wall Street within the Democratic Party than there are within the Republican. So there's complete upheaval in the political parties in the United States. The same is true in Great Britain. The Tory party could collapse entirely. The Labour Party, which was in total collapse because of ongoing attacks against someone like Jeremy Corbyn, is now likely to be the next Prime Minister of Great Britain in the near term. But look at Germany. Both the political parties which have dominated, in some cases since Bismarck, certainly the post-fall of the wall period, total changed. Spain, near civil war. France's both major political parties gone. In Czech Republic, both major political parties are now losing drastically to new parties. The entire political structure of the transatlantic has just fallen apart. Literally within a blink of an eye, the political parties are gone. Look at the media. The media is in a total crisis and disaster. It's the news media, it's this perpetual, ongoing kind of Orwellian state of CNN, the New York Times, NBC, the Washington Post's slogan is, "Democracy dies in darkness." I mean, these people are dying in their own melodramatic swamp. And then you say you have the same thing in Hollywood. And it's obviously sex in Hollywood. It's not really a story. I mean, my God. But the reality is that this has been a British cultural operation for the last century. And it's now it's getting exposed. Major sports, the sporting leagues, the NFL, the NBA, these things are in total crisis. Universities, look at Berkeley, look at Evergreen, look at these universities across the United States. They're just bankrupt. They're morally and intellectually bankrupt. They teach nothing. Their economics departments haven't changed. There have been ongoing financial breakdowns for 20 years, and they've not changed their economic curriculum once. Not even been a discussion that would be relevant. These things are just bankrupt, and people know it. Who would send their kids to college today? So, and then, like I said, you have this not just in the United States. This is all over Europe. Obviously, some of these cultural breakdowns are more severe here, but they're also the more dominant ones globally. Then you've got Trump called the CIA and the intelligence agencies in the United States like Nazi intelligence operations. This was in January or December at a press conference in Trump Tower. The CIA and the FBI are under the heat because of why? Because of our work on 9/11, the 28 pages, because people know these were cover-ups. Because of Mueller. Look what Mueller did with Hillary Clinton and the emails. I mean, these people are just exposed as lying frauds of the leading police state and kind of law enforcement agencies of the United States are criminal frauds themselves. And I'll go through that because it's part of our Mueller dossier in a second. Then you've got the terrorist situation. The United States has been basically sponsoring terrorism for what, 40 years, since the late 70s, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. With the Trump administration, you've now got a direct attack on that, and the recent State Department acknowledgement that al-Nusra is using chemical weapons has been a major blow to the British Empire's ability to deal with or to continue to foster some type of war in Syria. And of course, what Trump said to Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf state countries, they have to shut down the funding of terrorism. This hasn't been said in 40 years. This has been going on for 40 years. So then, of course, you have Trump's recent attacks on the insurance companies. I think he recently said in a press conference with the governor of Puerto Rico, the health insurance companies are talented enough at making money. They don't need any government bailouts. Puerto Rico's debt, sorry, Goldman Sachs or whoever owes the debt, you're not going to get it. It's gone. And he said something similar with the Greek prime minister about a debt reorganization there. You're starting to see that the crisis within the financial institutions, which we know it hit in 2008, has joined the media, the sporting groups, the cultural degeneracy generally, the political parties, the universities. The whole institutions of the West are in upheaval. So what does that mean? It means you have to create a new system, or die with the old one. Perish with the ones that are crumbling, or create a new system. Now, what we have seen over the last 20 years is the creation of a new system. And at the forefront of that system, whether it be in Russia, what Vladimir Putin has done in Russia, or what the Chinese leadership, especially under Xi Jinping in China, has done over these last 20 years, has been remarkable. Now, I'll just point out very quickly, the last 20 years in the United States and the West have been psychotic. The 20 years prior to that were insane. They were destructive. They might not have been totally psychotic, though. You did have Reagan's SDI program. You did have the end of the Cold War. You had a potential. But since '97, and the attempted impeachment of Bill Clinton, or removal, around his sexual escapades, which were published far and wide across the entire country, you've had the mass shootings. Columbine started in 1999. Put that in context of the recent Vegas shooting, which no one right now has any clue where that came from. Probably except, James Comey and Robert Mueller. I bet they have a better idea than most people do, which should give you a sense of where these things actually stem from. But 20 years of that process, financial breakdowns, financial bailouts, total degeneracy in terms of drug addiction, drug culture, the sex culture, the pornography that dominates the culture today, the rise of the so-called social issues, this transgender sexual identity, abortion insanity. I mean, this stuff is just, it's hard to make up. Selling fetal parts, this stuff is just nuts. And in some ways, you normalize. But the culture we've been living in has been nothing less than satanic. The rise of the internet, where young people are dealing with this internet culture, no one knows the effects of it, except suicide rates go up for 13-year-olds. That's one thing we know. So it's been psychotic. And yet you now have something taking place around the planet, which is different. You have Putin's moral authority on the terrorism question. Did that not have an impact on the election in the United States? A sense of moral authority on the strategic crisis of terrorism and world war? How about the question of China and Xi Jinping on the question of developments of every nation and every person on the planet? Did that not bring a new moral authority to the world? And you saw recently, I'm sure many people saw John Kelly's intervention on the media and to the American people, reminding people that, we used to have a sense of moral decency and a moral authority in the United States, a certain sense of concern for the well-being and sacredness of certain questions within human society. That, I would say, is minimally the foundation for a fundamental change in policy. Without that, you can't have a real policy, a real program of development. So the upheaval is drastic, but yet the change and opportunity for the new system is clearly there. And what stands out in all of it, and I think what has to be our focus as a political movement, is to bring Lyndon LaRouche back to the fore in terms of policy leadership in the United States in the coming period. And many of us may have come accustomed since the federal attacks against our movement to recognize, well, they really disparaged Lynn's name. They've made it hard to go with Lynn directly. We know that there were many compromises made in that regard. But let's be honest, how does our enemy define victory? They define it by keeping LaRouche out. Because if they can keep Lyndon LaRouche out from policy, then they can shut down the potential of real development in the United States. That's what they believe. They know the greatest threat is the leadership of Lyndon LaRouche as an intellectual and policy force. That's why China adopted his programs. That's why Putin collaborated with Lynn on a strategic intervention for Russia at the time in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that really is the question today. And I think if we define it that way, that's real victory. I think if we look at the situation in front of us, we'll clearly see how possible that kind of victory is in the coming weeks, maybe days, weeks, and possibly over the next coming months, the kind of changes. It's only been 9 months since Trump came into office. We're already seeing major changes. His trip to Asia will literally be on the anniversary. He'll be in China, I think, the day he got elected, a year from the day he got elected, in the process of things. The process is moving incredibly quickly, but we have to make sure that we recognize the great potential that exists and the kind of change that we can create. Okay, so let's get into the trip a little bit, because I think it's one indication of where the world's going. So if I can get the first slide. Can people see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so this is a forum that was held. It's been held 4 years. This is the 4th year by the People's Daily. And as one of their employees described to me recently, the People's Daily is like a government ministry. So it's basically the Chinese government holding something, coordinating international media around the Belt and Road. Now, the first 3 years they held this, it was to encourage the media. The 4th year, they got them out of Beijing. They took them out to a Western Chinese province where almost no one's ever been before. And they basically read them the Riot Act in a very sweet and polite and persuasive way, that this is the biggest project ever adopted by humanity. You probably should cover this. And kind of shamed them for not having covered it thus far. And it was by far the most aggressive, based on my discussions with Helga and Lynn, their recognition that this was a fundamental change in China's policy to make this far more of an aggressive push and a program of development. So let me get the next slide. Okay, good. This is just to give these young people recognition, but it was also one of the more charming and sweet aspects of the forum that I got a different sense of what's happening. So we went out to Gansu province, and I'll get to that in a second. But these were young volunteers, and they come from 3 different universities in Gansu province, which is like coming out of like Nebraska, basically, or Nevada, or Wyoming. They're all language students, seniors in college in language, and they were volunteers to get experience and to help kind of keep things on board. And I mean, they did that. I mean, literally, we got back from one session, and we're told we had 15 minutes to shower and put our suit on to go to the evening event. And within 15, literally on the 15-minute mark, I got a call saying, "Where are you?" So, but you saw kind of a sense of optimism. You saw a pride in these young people who are probably for the first generation going to college from their families. There was a sense of dignity. There was a sense of morale. There was an intensity. There was a pride in everything their country is doing right now. And that's not unsimilar to what you saw, I think probably what many of you saw back in the 1950s and 60s. There were certainly problems then. There are still problems in China today. But the aspects which we now look back and know were absolutely good and right are now developing in China within this generation. And it was really special, very sweet to get a sense of that, because you would never intersect these kids in most trips to China. And that was a special sense of it, to get a different sense of what's taking place there. Okay, so the next slide. All right, so this is every participant in the conference. This was big. This is a picture in the Great Hall. The person in the front row in the center is Zhang Gaoli. He's the vice premier that handles economics, including the Belt and Road. You have a number of other Chinese figures, People's Daily figures, and a number of leading figures in media from around the world. Rossiyskaya Gazeta from Russia was a special guest, a leading figure from Nigeria. The head of the Irish news agency, who said the Maritime Silk Road goes from Beijing to Dublin. He was very supportive. And then you have media from all over the world: Africa, South America, many from Africa, Asia. There were 4 people from the United States, 2 of which live in China. So there are only 2 of us that actually live in the United States that attended. And I was one of them. So that was a little unique. I had a lot of discussions with a lot of the people on what's actually happening in the United States, what's actually going on with Trump, the political upheaval, because you can imagine, they practically know nothing, though many of them didn't necessarily dislike Trump or the direction things are going. But they really had no idea the real nature of the political situation or the economic devastation of the United States. It's still hard for people to imagine. What we know is just kind of obvious: the opioid crisis, the massive unemployment, the homelessness, the loss of manufacturing, the skyrocketing costs of rents and food. People just have no idea. I mean, CNN's just not covering that in the airports around the world. Anyways, obviously a very impressive picture, a lot of people in a very big summit. Next picture. I also happen to be, somewhat surprisingly, and I'll get to it, I think, why this was the case, but they invited 14 people from think tanks around the world to participate in a new Institute for International Studies hosted by the People's Daily. It's like a new think tank. I'm on the far left of your picture. I was in the far right on the top of the other one. I'm on the far left of this one. And so that was exciting. They're very ceremonial. It's a very interesting quality, just as a comment culturally, between the kind of casual nature of the West. Especially, I mean, like, you know, wearing a suit and tie in California makes you look like it's archaic. You know, most of the guys that run Google and these kinds of things, if they feel, you know, you're lucky if they're wearing a T-shirt. So the ceremonial nature, the sense of a little bit of formality, was actually somewhat refreshing. It captured a quality of optimism in the culture and a certain sense of significance and dignity that you just find lacking on a lot of the things that we do or have been doing. Okay, at least on the West Coast. I know it's a little different out here. Next slide. Oh, just on the think tank, I don't know what it does or what it's going to be doing. I can't say anything more than I was invited to participate. They're really kind of fly by the seat of your pants, and I've mentioned this to some of the people in Houston before. Now let's get at the reason of why I was there and maybe why I was even invited to the think tank. Because we are the moral authority as an institution on the planet. When Donald Trump goes to Asia and meets Xi Jinping is an agent of the LaRouche program. That's what the Belt and Road is. Because the Belt and Road was developed by Helga Zepp-LaRouche as the New Silk Road because of a potential to create East and West collaboration. But the principle underneath it has been a program of economic development and as a conception that Lyndon LaRouche has had since he started this process 50 plus years ago. The International Development Bank, people know. What's this other one say? Yeah, in talks with Indira Gandhi. These things have been instrumental, have been what we are as a movement. This is what we've been organizing for 50 years. We've created a new international economic system. That's what we've done. It's not yet been adopted by the United States, but is now a driving force. And these are certainly the seeds of the conceptions of it, such as the IDB. And that's largely why I was invited, our outreach in this direction here in the United States, and certainly why I would have been invited to be part of the think tank. So next slide. And this just gets at it. I mean, look, 1992, this is the EIR that first published the New Silk Road Perspective. 1992, 25 years ago. And then, of course, you have the EIR report that I think all of us are familiar with, 1997. So just to give people a sense of what role we've been playing in this. Next slide. Here's the map from the 97 event. It's is just striking. And it's something that demonstrates what kind of potential we have right now in the world and the kind of threat we represent to change the entire policy situation in the United States. Because this has been adopted. These trains are running. The United States State Department just endorsed our map was a little bit off. China decided to go actually directly into Pakistan. So you see the Lahore area north of Delhi. China's going from Urumqi in the west into Lahore, basically, into Pakistan. This is called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The United States State Department has just told Pakistan they fully endorse the project and all development projects of this nature because of their benefit. So that's a substantial shift, and it's on the eve of Trump's trip to Asia. Okay, next slide.
No.
And then we, of course, expanded this, and as people know, this is not an Asia project. It's a it's a principle. You know, one thing we discussed here this morning, the United States is a transcontinental nation. It has always been conceived as transcontinental. As soon as we had our own government and our own economic program to be adopted, Hamilton was already driving west with the canal systems. We had the Louisiana Purchase. You had the transcontinental rail system. You then had the Four Corners projects. You then had the interstate highway system. And that really is continental, not just east and west and north to south. And you have the Kennedy-era Nawapa project, which really fulfills the full continental development. Transcontinental development is the new Silk Road. It is a Eurasian development program. And the United States has been following that as its policy. That is the American model or the American system. It's transcontinental development. And of course, what we're talking about with the World Land Bridge is an intercontinental program of development. And it really is. It captures the principle of it. This is not an Asian project. It's not a project in Asia. It is a principle that can be applied everywhere. We've been doing it for 200 years. Okay, next slide. This is just always a fun map. This is our most recent, I guess, expression of the World Land Bridge. And it gives people, I think, a sense of why this Bering Strait, why this US, Russia, China collaboration is so important. Okay, next slide. And then, of course, the 3 reports. And if you haven't gotten one of these, you certainly shouldn't be leaving that office today without having purchased one, and probably some more. It's not a bad time to start buying Christmas gifts, and these are perfect. So next slide. Is that it? I think that might be it. Oh, no, right, we got more. That's right. Okay, so just a little bit. Gansu, the conference is in Gansu province, which is kind of like that, I guess, leg of lamb shaped like province in the northwest of China. The city we were in was Dunhuang. You can kind of see that in the center left of the map. So I had a chance to fly from Beijing all the way out to Dunhuang across the kind of Yellow River Basin. And it's a striking territory. There's almost nothing in China that's even, maybe in the northeast. I don't know what the provinces northeast of Beijing are like, but certainly everything west and south of Beijing is more like the western part of the United States than it is like the northeast, where much of our industry and development of our country and farming and the farm belts, they don't have that. They don't have these massive prairies, irrigated by massive rivers for huge swaths of land like we do. So the situation is just drastically different. The topology, the geography is extreme. And I'll just show you some more pictures. We can go to the next slide. Dunhuang is actually on the old Silk Road. So you can kind of see it. It's right where the fork in the road is. If you go from Xi'an, which is where the old Silk Road started in Shanxi province, you go west, you run into Dunhuang, and then it splits into 2 different routes. And Dunhuang is right where the Gobi Desert from Mongolia intersects the Taklamakan Desert in western China. And it's just an incredible area. I've never seen anything like it. If you go to the next map, you'll see. This is Dunhuang. This is the great oasis. This is where the camels could always find a fresh drink of water. As they finally reached this point, it's where you would fill up your water canisters as you moved into the Taklaman Desert. It's still a natural oasis today. They say there's massive underground reservoirs, and this is the pagoda, which was built as a fortress to kind of protect the caravans. So look at the next slide. And these are the sand dunes that are outside Dunhuang. So this is, you can see all the poplar trees. They've done massive, massive landscaping, mostly these poplar trees everywhere. And you can see all the new buildings they built. It's in traditional Chinese architecture. They built it as a massive resort area, but for national conferences, they have a new conference center, a new concert hall, new convention center. It's a huge development. It's somewhat breathtaking in this small desert town. But these sand dunes were just breathtaking. It looks like the Sahara Desert. So next slide. So this is, you can actually get camel tours today into the desert dunes. You can also walk up the desert dunes. This is a big tourist attraction. But of course, it gives you a sense of what the old Silk Road would have looked like as they marched into the desert. So just kind of cute.
Oh, cute.
And that's the old Silk Road. I mean, this is what they're wanting to kind of give people a taste or a flavor of, and maybe to put a historical context into what this project is, so that it's not so practical. They're not willing to, they don't want to intellectualize the project. They're very, they're very conservative in how they'll discuss the Belt and Road right now. Because the media, they can't trust the media. They can't trust Western interests, how they'll take it and how they'll criticize it. But instead, they seem to be wanting to at least remind people of an ancient heritage of mankind over 2,000 years of trade, of relationships, of discussions, so that it doesn't, as much as the Cold War still lingers, the Cold War is 75 years. The Silk Road is 2,000 years. And obviously China thinks of itself as a civilization that's 5,000 years. So you get a sense of, I think that's their approach, and that's why they held the conference out here. Next slide. They really are just breathtaking dunes. You can see why it's a very arid area. If a massive river used to run through it also, and I'll show you aspects of that. But you can see in the middle of the picture, that's a propelled hang glider. So it's almost like a lawnmower, right, on the back of it with a propeller.
Wow.
And you can fly around the sand dunes. And that would have been fun. But it's a very neat picture, and obviously making it a tourist attraction. But it's a beautiful area. And sunset and sunrises were just incredible. So next picture. Okay, this is, if you imagine to the right of this picture, you would get to the sand dunes. And that's basically the end of the Gobi Desert. And this is the beginning of the Taklaman Desert. And right in between them, as along the base of these mountains, and then right before the sand dunes start, you get this massive riverbed that's now dry. They changed the direction, I think, of it. But this is the Taklaman Desert. This is what the camel caravans would soon be intersecting. You can just see how arid and barren this area is. So that's just kind of neat to see the geography. It's much like Nevada. Okay, next picture. Okay, this is the old river basin, and it's all dried up. You can see the poplar trees they planted. But those are the caves. In this massive river sediment that you see built up, it's like a sandstone, but it's not condensed. It's almost just like river sediment buildup. So you could just chip away at it with a knife or any kind of metal tool. So in the 4th to 9th century, they started building these caves. I think they started building them because it's a perfect air conditioning system for the hot summer months. But what you'll see, they did much more than just use them as air conditioning. So I'll show the next slide. So here are more of the caves. You can see they're kind of carved into this very brittle sandstone. The next slide. This is the area where the caves were transformed, and so they've kind of solidified the wall and put entry doors on them. And I'll show you why in a second. The next slide. This is part of the cultural heritage of China. They consider it their oldest relic of real cultural development. Now, I have to say, just to be, I haven't been to ancient Egypt or I haven't been to ancient Greece, but imagining the Parthenon, which is, what, 300 years ago, ancient Egypt, and the pyramids, which are 4,500 years ago. This is 1,500 years ago. But what you have to imagine is that this is part of the old Silk Road. And what it will demonstrate as I get into the pictures in a second is a kind of cultural renaissance in the middle of the desert that coincided this kind of flourishing trade, this flourishing international trade of different languages, different cultures, different religions, and an economic dynamic bringing materials from the Himalayas north into this area in Western China to use as paints, as jewelry, as gems. I mean, there was a massive industrial culture that could create a renaissance such as this. So inside this building is a 4-story tall carved Buddha.
Wow.
It's the 3rd largest Buddha in the world. I don't have a picture of it, but it's enormous. It's an enormous Buddha. All you can really see is like the foot and the knee. But it is somewhat exceptional. But then these are some of the caves that have been transformed. And go to the next slide. So this is one example of the caves. They're all more or less the same, but the sizes vary. This is a smaller cave. The larger ones can have roofs of 40 feet high. They can be, or taller. They can definitely be 40, 50, 60 feet deep. And they were turned into Buddhist temples. It became kind of like a cultural fad at the time because of the flourishing of Buddhism along the Silk Road to develop these caves that were used probably as kind of summer dwellings or storage facilities. I'm not sure. They don't really know exactly, but they were certainly turned into these remarkably beautiful caves. And all of the paints are still the original paints. They were using rock-based paints coming from the Himalayas, like lapis, the dark blue, rich color, or the malachite that Jason showed in his economic course, the green copper, or opal, the black stones that come out of the mountains closer to Dunhuang. So these paints are incredibly rich. How they painted without much light is somewhat extraordinary. All of these have been carved out of the sandstone and then plastered. And so you just get a rich sense of a culture, of an economy, of a society that flourished in this area. The next picture.
Wow.
So you can see this is one of the medium-sized caves. And you can just see the detail and the paints in the quality of optimism, the color. A certain sense of joy just stems from all of this, which really captures, I think, China's sense of joy around the Belt and Road today, the sense of a cultural flourishing that is totally contrary to what you see in the West, where you see just this kind of perverse cultural degeneracy that has become so rampant. Given the next slide, it'll give a detail of this ceiling. So those are the original paints. Those are the original colors. And it's just very striking, the size and scope and detail and craftsmanship that was involved. 1,500 years ago in the middle of the desert in some caves to create a sense of celebration and a sense of real cultural dynamic. Obviously, China was building much larger things like the Great Wall. They've built other magnificent structures, but this is out in the middle of the desert. Next picture. This is one of the larger caves. This time the temple goes all the way around. You can see all the detail along the walls, the ceiling, and you get the sense that almost it was a competition who can build the bigger and nicer temples. There's just so many. I think there was something like I'm getting a bit of an echo, but I think there was something like 200, 300 caves that have been transformed into temples, maybe 400. So it's somewhat remarkable. I only saw half a dozen. Next picture. I'm still getting an echo.
Is the mic turned on here?
Okay, and this is just another example. Yeah, still getting the echo. Oh, that's better. Just another example of the wall, the ceiling. You know, obviously it's somewhat amazing what they were doing. So next slide. Okay, so that was the trip to Dunhuang. There was also a conference. It wasn't just these tourist things. But as I said, the main focus of all of the presentations was really to cover the Belt and Road project. Why aren't you covering this? It's magnificent. This is just some of the architecture. This is the People's Daily New online headquarters. So this does all of their online social media work. And I'll show you a few more pictures just to give you a sense of it. Next picture, yeah. This is what they call their central kitchen. Of course, the Chinese love food. This is where all the editors get together. They look at a massive, you can see on the back wall, a massive touch screen where they can go through every article posted, every social media post, look at which provinces are reading the most articles, which articles the provinces are reading, and what the age bracket and demographic breakdown is of who's reading the articles and who's following them. So they have a real kind of ongoing gauge to see what articles they want to follow up with. It was a totally state-of-the-art press room. All the media people that I was with were totally impressed and shocked by the level of operations that they have. So next. That's the screen, that's the touch screen, pretty impressive. And then next. Okay, we also had a chance to go to the Great Hall, as you saw with the large picture of everyone. The Great Hall has 32 rooms, one for each province. So this is one of them on the right. That's the exterior on the outside. It was a privilege to go in. This is the center of the Chinese government. So I'll just give you a few more pictures. So you get to see this is it was an interesting format. It wasn't a person standing at a podium giving a lecture. The vice premier, Zhang Gaoli, said, okay, well, what do you guys have to say about the forum? And he opened it up to all the journalists that were there that were special guests. They each gave their thoughts and contributions. And then he gave an hour-and-a-half speech in response to that about the Belt and Road and China's development. So it was kind of interesting, and you can see it was kind of relaxed and casual in a funny way. The way they were sitting in chairs, they created a dialogue within those people. So that was neat. And then, of course, the bottom picture, they served this whole leaf green tea, which I'm not a big green tea person, but it was pretty good green tea. So you'll find that they use the same cups at the National Congress recently held in this past week. Okay, next picture. Okay, and then there's our land bridge reports. So they can take the slide screen off. So okay, so the main points. That's my trip to China. Why was this all happening? It's because of the role the LaRouche organization, the Schiller Institute, is playing, and clearly China recognizes this. Helga recently said there's so many requests from Chinese media that she can't do all the interviews. When I got back to San Francisco, I did a follow-up with the People's Daily, and we did an interview with Helga that was part of a short video show, which was very effective. But she's got tons of requests. They have blatantly identified the LaRouche organization as the leading figures. And you know what's interesting is that means that the origin of this project did not come from Asia. It came from the West. It came from, so it's a question of how we think about these projects, which is so interesting. But the main thing I want to then go through is what we're now doing here. So in light of what I said at the beginning, there's clearly a change. All of the institutions are breaking down in the West. and we're leading an intervention around Lin's 4 laws that that's the foundation for a change in policy. How do we do this? Well, Trump's going to China and going to Asia, and I'll get to that in a second. But I just want to touch on a couple of things then, because look at what we've done. We have this Mueller dossier that Keisha showed, which is, people have seen it. I'm not going to re-show it. But just we got this out, I think, maybe 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago. We started getting this out in New York City. What's happened since then? 2 lawyers, 2 leading figures in the legal community, both who know Mueller. One, this guy Silverglate from Boston, another lady, Sidney Powell from Texas, both condemned Mueller. Silverglate, who's a leading defense attorney in the national defense attorney community, compared Robert Mueller to Tomás de Torquemada, the Spanish inquisitor. The last time that's been referenced politically was in the Children of Satan 2 pamphlet of the LaRouche organization, targeting Dick Cheney as the Grand Inquisitor of the Bush campaign. And that quality of violence and intimidation was the basis of policy. So Sidney Powell came out and attacked Mueller and his entire team and said they don't intend on justice. And the same thing, Silverglate said the same thing. Then you have another Texas lawyer, Ty Clevenger. He filed a bar grievance in New York, basically calling for James Comey to be disbarred, to have criminal investigations over his perjury, lying, and obstruction of justice on the Hillary Clinton case. This guy blatantly said to Congress months ago that he didn't make any decision about the case until he investigated all of the witnesses, including Hillary Clinton. And then he had the guts to say, this is James Comey to the House Intelligence Committee, if any of my former associates think otherwise, please have those individuals call me personally so I can correct their record. Can you imagine? He knows that people are telling the members of Congress that that's not true. And he's got the nerve to say, those people, they're lying, they're confused. Have them call me. I'd like to know who those people are. This guy is sick. And he's caught red-handed, having already said in an email he was going to let Hillary Clinton go months before 24 witnesses were investigated, including Hillary Clinton. So this guy could be disbarred. There could be a criminal investigation. And there's increasing pressure in Congress on that. Then you've got a letter from 19 congressmen calling for Robert Mueller to have hearings on Mueller, to have congressional oversight, because who is this guy? He's got major conflicts of interest. He knows James Comey. He's got unprecedented power, and who knows what kind of investigation he's even running, and the American people have a right to have oversight. So that's come since the Mueller dossier was out. So we have 2 major attacks on Mueller directly, a major attack on James Comey legally, 19 members of Congress. You've got Comey's massive email scandal with Hillary Clinton, which is itself a major discussion process. Senators Grassley and Representative Nunes have both sent letters to the FBI and DOJ asking who funded this dossier, which is the whole dodgy dossier, British intelligence, Christopher Steele, and Mueller is the only guy that's even talked to him. Then you've got the House Intelligence Committee has subpoenaed Fusion GPS, who distributed the dossier and paid Christopher Steele, where they got the money, who paid for this research. And 2 of their people were brought to the House and pleaded the 5th because they know they're guilty of a major setup, an attempted coup against the sitting president of the United States. And you've got the House going to subpoena Fusion GPS for their bank records over the last 2 years. Fusion GPS has now gone and filed an attempted injunction against that request, but it's only simply delaying the inevitable. We're going to find out who paid for it. And Donald Trump sent a tweet out saying, who paid for this? The FBI? Did the FBI pay for this fake dossier as part of did the FBI for Obama pay for opposition research against me while James Comey was letting Hillary Clinton off the hook for certain crimes, but obviously the cover-up is far worse than the crimes, so that Hillary Clinton would become president? This whole thing is nasty looking. At the same time, Samantha Powers, who was the UN ambassador, requested 260 people's names unmasked in classified intelligence reports. 260 Americans. That's one in just the last year of her service. That's one for every single working day. She goes to the House under investigation and she says, they might have been requested under my name, but I didn't do them. Well, wait a minute, you can't, this isn't like a permission request to go on a field trip. This is a legal procedure to identify American citizens illegally. Basically, you're wiretapping Americans and violating their Bill of Rights for some basis, for some so-called reason. And now somebody's falsifying those documents inside the Obama administration. This looks pretty bad. The whole thing begins to unfold. And then today, Trump sent out a tweet, which I think is perfect, because as many people know, the dossier is not just about Mueller's investigation of Trump. It touches three main areas. One is the attacks on the LaRouche organization. And I think that's the most important part, because what we intend to do is demonstrate to people, if you want Donald Trump to succeed, if you want an economic recovery, if you want to destroy this fascist coup and the media vermin that push it, then you are fighting with and for Lyndon LaRouche. Because that's what was happened. The people that are doing this to Trump are the same institutions that did it to Lyndon LaRouche. And that's the reality. And we said it. If you let it be done to us, it'll be done to every other institution. And that's what's happening. And that's the first part. The second part then is on the 9/11 cover-up. Well, Donald Trump today tweeted out that in possibly less than a week, he's going to release the 30,000 documents related to the John Kennedy assassination. This was clearly this is a threat. Now, who knows what's in those documents? If they're all written by Alan Dulles, then they're probably not worth very much. But it's unlikely that that's the case. It's likely that there are the 28 pages of the JFK assassination. There are going to be things that indicate that maybe, as many of us probably suspect, it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, and who was really behind it and how the operation worked. But the same is true about 9/11. There are probably 30,000 boxes or 30,000 files in an FBI office in Florida that document FBI involvement with Saudi Arabia. And who was running the FBI when those documents were collected and prevented from reaching any kind of congressional investigation? Oh, that was Robert Mueller. And so the threat to bring down this fascist operation, the one that took place after Franklin Roosevelt died, that went after John Kennedy and the space program, that went after the LaRouche organization and the SDI project, that then launched the kind of perpetual war policy, the 9/11 attacks, and this whole police state mass shooting scenario. We can bring that down and bring Lyndon LaRouche and our policies and our sense of morality, which is a higher quality of morality, of real advancement and development, to the policy discussion. So that's really what's happened with the Mueller dossier since it's been initiated. And clearly, over these next few weeks into Trump's trip to Asia, we have to escalate that. We've got the palm cards. You got the palm cards. We don't have any yet, so we better be getting some. That's all I got to say. But we've got the palm card program. We've got to initiate and escalate that campaign. So now, I know I've covered a lot. What I want to do is just briefly touch on Trump's trip to Asia, and then we'll take questions for the time remaining. Trump's trips to Asia is happening in a remarkable scenario, remarkable circumstances. Besides the fact that we have the U.S. State Department endorsing the China-Pakistan corridor, which is one of the major 6 parts of the Belt and Road Initiative. Trump is not only going to China, he's going to Japan, where Japan has just endorsed the Belt and Road project. He's going to Seoul, Korea, and they just committed to building their two next nuclear power plants against even the interests of their own president or wishes of their own president. And you've got a 2-day visit to Xi Jinping. Then he's going to Vietnam for an APEC summit. You're going to have Chile, Peru, Mexico. You're going to have Modi and a number of the other nations of Southeast Asia, Modi from India, at the APEC summit, heads of state. And then you're going to have Putin, and Putin's going to be there. And then Putin, Modi, Abe, Xi, Trump are all going to be at the Manila conference for the ASEAN +6 summit. This is going to be a massive tour de force. And what is Trump going into? It's not, the first trip abroad was to Saudi Arabia, NATO, and the G7, dying institutions, a collapsing transatlantic. Like I said, all the institutions, the G7, NATO, the whole Saudi operation in the Middle East, all of that's collapsing. The population, the nations exist, but under what organization is the question. In Asia, Trump is going into a new world. These leaders, like Abe, Xi, Putin, Duterte of the Philippines, they like Trump. They like his anti-terrorism stance. They support the anti-war program. They support the calls for infrastructure. They're against drugs. They're for a traditional cultural orientation of family, young children, technology, industry, and they're looking to collaborate with any leader who will help foster that. Trump is going into a fundamentally different world than the transatlantic. And the fact that you see this orientation towards Asia coming from Tillerson, coming from Trump and Trump's State Department, even McMaster, the head of the National Security Council, gave an interview saying that we're going to collaborate with Russia. We're looking for ways of cooperation. Tillerson is leading the charge. This is someone who clearly I don't think I'm a personal fan of, but he's been marched out by the Trump administration to indicate that we're looking for ways to work with every nation, including Russia. So the situation in the United States, with the breakout against the coup, the infrastructure devastation, as you know, in Houston, Florida, and Puerto Rico, Trump's recognition that debt has to be wiped out. We've got to rebuild. We've got to rebuild with nuclear power. Even your old favorite governor, Rick Perry, is championing nuclear power. Who would have thought, right? As Linda LaRouche once called it, it was the Alexander the Great principle. They might have been corrupt, immoral, degenerate bastards just a few years ago. But if they're working with us now, we're going to march them hard and fast in the right direction. That's what Alexander the Great did to wipe out the satanic scourge of that time period in the world. We're going to do the same thing today, and we're going to march people who recognize the moment we're in, that we're at a Shelley moment of potential major change, which is why we're getting invited to these international summits. It's why we're recruiting people from Congress, from the institutions in New York City around Trump, the international community and consulates, to work with us to shut down this fascist coup, shut down this satanic cultural orientation, and begin to move the United States in the direction of a Pacific century of broad-scale development. And it's anything like this. It's an unprecedented moment in human history. Nothing like this has ever been seen before. And it's certainly the creation of Lyndon, Helga, and the LaRouche organization. We should be incredibly proud. We should also have the direct responsibility as the captain of any ship to make sure we bring this ship to full harbor and really create a new world for all of mankind. So I think that's my sense of the situation and my unique sense of the trip. And I'm happy to take any questions and look forward to hearing what you're thinking.
Okay, come up here in the middle so that you can see.
Hi, I just want to recap of what you said. Since the dossier came out on what has happened to upset the mood?
Say it again.
Oh. Can you recap what has happened since the release of the Mueller dossier?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I guess I got a note from somebody saying my sound is kind of choppy. Can people hear me okay?
Well,
yes. We
Okay.
can hear you.
Your sound has not been the best. But We managed to make it out. It's been going in and out.
And go in and out.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
This digital stuff. Okay, so, well, I'll just go through it quickly. You've had two lawyers, major figures in the legal community nationally, Silverglate and Sidney Powell, both come out with direct attacks against Mueller, one referencing him as Tomas de Torquemada. Then you had a guy named Ty Clevenger, a lawyer from Texas, file a bar grievance in New York, which means that he's challenging Comey's position as part of the New York bar, which means it would end his status as a lawyer in New York, and it would mean criminal investigations. You've had 19 congressmen file a letter to the heads of the House and Senate Judiciary calling for oversight hearings on Mueller and his investigation. You had a major scandal break out around James Comey and the whole question of Hillary Clinton's emails, his perjury, and the subsequent bar grievance filing. You've had letters from both Senator Grassley and Representative Nunes on the funding of the fake dossier by Christopher Steele and Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS employees have pleaded the fifth, and their bank records have now been subpoenaed by the House committee, which will indicate who's funded the fake dossier. And Trump himself has tweeted who's funding the fake dossier. All of this gets at the core of the false premise of what the coup operation has been, and also gets at directly Mueller's own the idea that he's some good Boy Scout of the political establishment, good old Marine Corps, is absolutely a fraud. He is at best an amoral legal assassin. I think he's probably an asshole scumbag that probably deserves the title Tomas de Torquemada. And if you've got a liberal defense attorney from Boston who's got stronger language than the LaRouche organization, we've got a change in political paradigm.
He's actually the Harvey Weinstein of FBI.
Hi, Michael. Helga has made a big point about the optimism in China and the happiness. And I wondered if you could comment on the effect of that on someone like Trump, who tends to be an optimistic person and have good ideas, but has been under all this assault in the recent period.
Yeah, I think that's why we have to really use our imagination to recognize the power and potential of these coming weeks into and during and coming out of Trump's trip to Asia. Because certainly, at this point, the world in Asia is just drastically different. I remember I was doing some follow-up on my cell phone program, and I ended up talking to a girl in the Philippines. This happened multiple times, because you always get the Philippines with this particular company. And I would ask them what they think about Duterte. They'd be a little shy at first, but then they'd say, actually, I really like him. And then I'd make some positive comments, and they go, I really like him. I think what he's doing is really good. We got to clean up the drugs. We got to create a better society. There's a sense of engagement from young people, of an enthusiasm and an excitement about the future of their society. I don't know how Trump will get a chance to intersect that, but we have to have a sense that he's going to be immersed in that kind of culture for 10 days, and that the leadership of these countries are going to represent that kind of optimism. Abe and Putin signed a deal to build to look at the plans to build a rail system from Sakhalin Island all the way into Japan. That's part of our map. If you go back to the map from 1997, we have a rail line going from Russia through Sakhalin Island and down into Japan. So, this is the ancient course of humanity before the great floods. One more, that one, yeah. You can see it in the far east of Russia. So this kind of potential is just there. It's the entire cultural orientation of the leadership and of the populations. And so I think Trump's going to realize, and I think we've got to make sure that we create the conditions for this realization to be accepted by the United States, that the future of the United States exists in the Pacific. It exists in Asia, it exists in the Indo-Pacific basin, and that over the course of his presidency, that's the orientation he's going to take. Because, I guess, in contradiction to what Steve Bannon understands, China did not take our manufacturing away from us, just like it was not the Mexican immigrants who frauded the big Wall Street banks during the housing bubble. I mean, I think we know that that's not how the housing bubble got built, because these Mexican immigrants were just so crafty at manipulating these home mortgage lenders. Neither was China so crafty that we gave up all of our manufacturing and industry and scientific orientation. It was destroyed and dismantled in the United States. And Trump understands that characteristic. He's going to go there and see a very warm, optimistic, and vibrant culture. Not because everything's perfect in Asia, but the vibrancy of what you saw with John Kennedy's orientation in the United States and Eisenhower's administration here is what the vibrancy Trump's going to intercept. It wasn't perfect in the United States. It never is. But the vibrancy of an optimism towards development and towards the future, that's what we can look forward to creating here. And it's something that we've got to instill in the population. It's also a question of having Trump have the guts to go directly with Lyndon LaRouche.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's real victory. Glass-Steagall is important, it's critical. I'm sure we'll all have big celebrations when we get that policy implemented. But we want the LaRouche program implemented. We want Lyndon LaRouche in his role. It's kind of like the discovery of gravitation. You can know all of Kepler's discovery, but if you don't know Kepler and you haven't read his personal writings on how he made it, do you really know the discovery? Are you really capable of advancing that scientific orientation? The discoverer is as important, if not more so, than the discovery itself. And I think we've got to look at that, because that's really the kind of unbridled optimism we should have about this kind of moment. We're going to really get revenge against these British bastards. And that's the one thing that they fear the most, is the revival of Lyndon LaRouche as the intellectual and political leader of this new orientation.
Hi, Mike.
Hi.
So obviously you went to China very prepared and probably had certain ideas that I was curious if there were things that you realized from going that you hadn't thought about before in terms of perhaps the challenges that China's facing, or perhaps, what Bill Jones was talking about last night on the webcast in terms of what China would benefit from working with the United States. I'm just curious those kind of observations you might have had.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think some of it was on the ground. I think the vice premier in his speech said that China is something like 92nd in the world in per capita GDP. So that presents a certain obvious challenge in itself. I've been to Asia once before. I was in Vietnam. And I went out one night in Dun Huang to the kind of the downtown area, the kind of tourist area. And it was tourist, but it was a lot of people, a lot of local people too. I mean, it's still very poor. I got a chicken soup at the airport, at the international terminal, and all it was chicken bones and skin. I mean, that's what the meat was. I mean, the noodles were great, but the meat was just bone and skin. You know, and you realize that that's the legacy of having that's what China would have been like 20, 25 years ago. One person here, when I gave the presentation after the trip, he said he was in China in '92, and it was just, Beijing was simply just bicycles everywhere. That's all they had. Now most people drive Audi SUVs or other nice cars. But they still have a little pathway for the old communist mopeds and bicycles. They've got, I didn't expect this. In Beijing, with these remarkable buildings, they have 5-story tall apartment buildings, probably built in the 1950s, with a ton of poor people in Beijing still living in them. And then right next door will be a massive, remarkably beautiful office building or condos, or just surrounding the 5-story apartment building. And then in that apartment building, you see people outside. They're poor. They're selling little trinkets. They've got their bicycles or old, 30-year-old mopeds. So they're not gentrifying. they're just building up the entire area, and they create, like I said, they have a highway, practically a highway, 3 lanes in each direction, and then on each side they have a little small avenue for the mopeds and bicycles. So that if you're poor, you're not all of a sudden having to compete with an army of Saudi SUVs. You can still operate and function. So there's still a lot of problems. In Dun Huan, it reminded me of Vietnam in terms of the kind of poverty you saw. But it's different. The poverty is in the clothes people are wearing, or the general size. The diet that they've clearly grown up on has not been the most nutritious diet, you can tell. But the optimism and happiness of people was just so striking. So, there's still a lot to develop. I mean, it's going to be, Xi Jinping gave minimally a 35-year perspective at the National Congress. And I think we have to take that as there's a 35-year plus commitment to the Belt and Road. And that's really how this project is 35 to 50 years to fulfill what that idea is. That's 2 more generations in China. And guaranteed within 50 years, the generations growing up in China, in areas like Dunhuang or those apartment buildings in Beijing, are going to be totally changed. But they think of it. They think of it in a way of inclusiveness. That's what I got a sense of. They don't kind of shun the poor. Oh, you're poor, you're pushed aside. And one young lady I talked to, she said, there's all this talk of the smog, and you get these horrible liberals. Oh, but it's so smoggy there. One young lady said that in 24 hours, they can turn the skies in Beijing to be electric blue. That's the term they use, electric blue. I said, 24 hours, huh? She says, yeah, they know the factories that produce the smog. So as soon as they turn those factories off, the skies become blue. She says, I said, well, she said, but they can't shut those factories down because tens of thousands of people work there. And that would create a social crisis. So clearly, what are they doing? They're going to phase out. They'll just retire people out of those factories, diminish the capacity, build what they need to produce elsewhere, and eventually and upgrade the factories, the new ones, and eventually close those factories. So 15, 20, 25 years, those factories will be out of existence. The skies in Beijing will be totally clear, and the smog problem will be solved. But they're not going to damage and injure their own population and the livelihood that they have. So they're very patient, and it's very thoughtful, and all the things that we complain about are not in context to where China's going, but how inclusive they are with their approach. It has a very loving and supportive quality. That I'll tell you, the one thing that I was really struck at after the trip, and I say this with caveats of, I'm not saying China's perfect, but what you get from China is a sense of how do I say this? People have read Plato's Republic, and in there was the idea of 3 different kinds of souls: bronze, silver, and golden souls. And the idea of a republic was to find those golden souls wherever they may be in your society and bring them up to the level of national leadership. That it really was what they described in China as a meritocracy. That you find the best that you can find. Now, what are the best? In China, it's incredibly hardworking, but it's moral, it's impassioned, there's a certain decency, there's a thoughtfulness, there's a sense of insight. They're cultivating that within people. Their premier, Li Keqiang, their kind of prime minister of sorts, was somebody who was a leading communist youth figure in college, head of the Beijing University he was at, as a student body president. But then one consulate member described it. They watched him from post to post. They see, how does he take on the next challenge and the next challenge? They're constantly grooming people to see if they've got the passion and the desire to really help develop China, to lead it, to solve the problems. And it really is kind of remarkable. You get that sense of a true meritocracy, or a true kind of republic, where you're looking for the best and brightest. And you find it that the people that are leading China do not all come from Yeah, they can say Xi Jinping's like a communist prince. His father was a leading figure. But the other members of the standing committee come from myriad backgrounds. One of them that could be on the next standing committee went to a community college and eventually got his degree after like 15 years of professional work. These are not people that all went to Harvard or Yale and went to the right places and just became part of the elite. They look for people who are competent to lead. And the idea that that exists, that we can create a society here that looks for the people that are impassioned and hardworking and insightful, not that went to the right school or said the right things or got the right grades, all this kind of this grooming, but people that actually know how to address real problems in society, and that you bring them and foster them into leadership. That was very heartening, because I think for all people who are have a higher quality of ideal of what it means to be human, you want your society to reflect and value that, unlike today's, which it practically disparages. Look at the attacks on Donald Trump for calling the widow of a fallen soldier. Look at this culture. It's vicious towards anything thoughtful. And I did get a sense, the little time I was there, and I'd say that the interaction with these college seniors from Gansu, to a translator who's a professor at Beijing, to the various layers I intersected with, there is that sense in China. And there's one guy we had dinner with who is now the president of People's Daily Online. And he's a wild drinker. I mean, we literally they have this corn whiskey. It's brutal. I mean, it's not bad, but it's 102 proof. I mean, it's, and this guy, we were the only table at the appreciation dinner that cracked open the bottle. And we were like doing shot after shot after shot. And gambe, which is like the toast, cheers, cheers. But he's a really wild guy. He ran the newspaper in Tianjin, or in Shandong, I believe. And he's a very charismatic, lively, wild guy. They're not, they're a very living population. They're very alive. And yet he did an excellent job at that. So, but there was a kind of moral decency to him, a certain liveliness to it. So it's a very playful culture, but you get the sense. And I by no means think China's perfect and every good person gets rewarded, but there is a different sense of what they value. They value a moral passion to solve problems, to really solve problems that we can and must cultivate in the United States. And that really was precious to be able to experience that, because coming from the generation I do, I've never seen it. I didn't see the space program. I didn't see that call to arms of young people, the best and brightest. All I've seen is the last 20 years of psychological terror and drugs and everything else. And so that was special. Special to hit. And even if it doesn't exist in China, that it exists in my mind is a pretty powerful idea.
Yes. We have another question.
Hi, I'm working with a group that's interested in actually buying and upgrading and expanding a Class 1 U.S. railroad. And obviously, I do recognize that China is a poor country, but they are willing and able to invest in infrastructure at a greater degree than in the United States. How are they doing that? I know that President Trump is going to China for something that might be related to infrastructure investment. But to be honest with you, I'm not so sure that something would succeed through that. If it does succeed, excellent, and I support it. But is there a backup just in case whatever Trump's plans are, if there's something else that can be done if that doesn't work?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think, we've got to get the presidency focused in this direction. And the presidency is a broader institution. And clearly, you have to imagine that with the executive orders on the Obamacare, on the insurance companies, on the debt questions, on the Belt and Road, on the terrorism, on Russia, on JFK assassination, I mean, Trump's, in the last 2 weeks, has done a tour de force to crack open much of what this establishment has pushed for 50 years. So I think we have to capture that and capture that optimism. But Brian Lance there has done a very important paper on how China has financed this infrastructure, 93, 94, 95. Glass-Steagall, public credit institutions, national banks, and then broadening that out to a broader banking and credit system. So China adopted what is the American model. It's not a system of tariffs like Steve Bannon and these other people want to categorize it as. That's the Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson program. That's not, if that's the American system, then that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Hamilton's American model approach of national banking and public credit. That is the only way Trump's going to fulfill the infrastructure developments of this country. Lyndon LaRouche in 1988, when he ran for office, called for $2 trillion of investment every year for the first 3 years to develop the most advanced productivity and highest standard of income in the United States ever achieved anywhere on the planet. And then after that, largely in broad-scale infrastructure, and then we would have to begin to invest in large-scale advancements in space and fusion development. But he was calling for $2 trillion in 1988 dollars. That's probably, if it's not 20 trillion, it's close. It certainly would be like 10 trillion a year. So 2 trillion a year in 1988, we should have at least $2 trillion a year today. And we should certainly look at immediate infrastructure development, New York City, the Midwest, Florida, Texas. I think those are the four corners of the East Coast. If you connect Houston to Chicago, Chicago to New York, and New York down to Florida, you've got four main areas. You develop the four corners, connect them. You've got clearly a capability of integrating what's kind of the Mississippi East area of the United States, or what's east of the Great Plains. Then we've got to do the West Coast corridor and then bring those things together for the development of the Midwest and Great Plains. That's got to be done. That can be done. And without that kind of credit system, it's not going to happen. So the most important thing is the fight around Lyndon LaRouche. Like, this organization knows it. When they went after Lynn and got Lynn indicted falsely, but got him indicted under perjury, and what's-her-face admitted to perjury later in deposition. So it was lies and set up and railroad to get Lyndon LaRouche's name tarnished. They went out to break LaRouche, to break his character, at least in public. They never broke it in reality. They tried. We know that LaRouche name represented the greatest of the United States. Its history, its culture, its policy, and its people. And what they did to Lynn, they've done to every single person since then that's attempted to do anything even approximate. We've got to bring the Lynn's name back. And by doing so, we create the basis for developing everything you're imagining. And every idea you have to implement railroads and high-speed rail in the United States can be accomplished under those political circumstances. Anything less, and it's going to be questionable, because you're still going to have some faction of this fascist program dominating and intimidating U.S. policy. Because there's only one reason people don't go with Lyndon LaRouche. It's not because he's wrong. It's not because he hasn't shaped this paradigm both in China as well as the Glass-Steagall infrastructure development program in the United States. It's simply because they're deathly afraid of having the same thing done to them by this fascist establishment. So it's time to crush that. We crush it with Mueller. We crush it with the entire operation around Mueller, the media, NBC, the New York Times. We know what those institutions are. We know how nasty these institutions have been for 30 years, 40 years. And we crush that. We create a different presidency. And in doing so, we create a presidency around LaRouche. And that's ultimately the most just. And if that happens, then the Trump presidency will be the most, not only will he be one of the greatest presidencies in U.S. history, he will be more trusted around the world than any presidency since Abraham Lincoln.
I think we should invite our guests to ask questions, right? I mean, the people that are new here today really should not be shy and step forward and ask questions. you know, all of us here have the opportunity to talk to Mike anytime we want. The phenol, Vladimir.
It's a habit. That's the question. Go ahead. Wait, we do have a question. 1 second.
Oh,
No, you go ahead.
hi, Mike. I think since you raised this issue of leadership, I mean, and you do it very well, and raised the question of platonic golden souls, and the question of meritocracy, I think those issues really shine in you. And I think it's inspiring to me. You know, this is what gives me hope of actually winning this. And I hope it inspires everyone here that this is not something you're born with, a golden soul. That's something that you develop over the course of your life. And I think people should know that you're just about to turn 40, which is about the age of Lynn when he started this organization. And that certainly inspires a beautiful, positive outlook about the future. So this isn't really a question, but I just wanted to present that because it's a tangible access to what it requires in each of us, you know, to develop in ourselves, which is the best weapon that we have against this pessimism that tends to pervade our culture. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Yes, little brother turning 40. Well, what I wanted to conclude with, just to go back, first of all, I want to let people know that in the latest edition of Executive Intelligence Review, and I'll turn around so the audience here can see it, is titled "Break the Coup Against Trump Before He Leaves for Asia." And there is a beautiful article in there, editorial by Michael, people can read if you are subscribed to EIR. It's called "On the Edge of Human Evolution, ? A Shelley Moment." And I think he's really laid out the perspective of what that conception of a Shelley moment, a rebirth of mankind, a rebirth of a renaissance for mankind really represents, and looking at the next 50 plus years, next 100 years for the future of mankind. So I want to thank Michael again for joining us today. I want to remind people here to take copies, contribute, take copies of the Mueller dossier and the push cards we have. Also, as you saw with Michael's presentation, we have copies of the 3 special reports for the New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. Very beautiful report. It is in Arabic and Chinese and English. Probably going to have it in other languages soon, but those are the ones we have here. So you can take those reports with you, and stay in contact with us so you will know when we're having rallies and when we're going out for distributions so that you can join us. In the meantime, get out this material because this fight is actually absolutely critical for bringing the United States into this new paradigm. Again, I go back to the original theme of creating a nightmare for the evil people and a dream for mankind. I think that we just had that perspective laid out for us. So again, thank you, Michael. And if you have anything else you want to conclude with, go ahead.
I'll conclude with the latest Trump tweet, which he just sent out, that officials behind the now discredited dossier plead the fifth. Justice Department and/or FBI should immediately release who paid for it. We've got some work to do. We've got an incredible environment. It was wonderful talking with you. Let's keep up the good work and talk soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.